Alright, so the plan for today is to talk about the southern colonies. As you know, we've talked about the New England colonies and then the middle colonies. Now we're keeping on working our way south to the southern colonies. So Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. That's what we're talking about today. Things that you're going to have to keep in mind, questions to be able to answer. Let's run through these real quick. First thing is, why was Maryland founded? So you've all heard of the state of Maryland, but before it was a state, it was an English colony. And you have to tell me why it was founded. Remember, the word founded means why it was started, why the colony of Maryland came about, what happened to make Maryland a thing. Next, why did Carolina become two colonies? So you know of North and South Carolina, two separate colonies, but there was a reason why there's a North and a South Carolina. There was once just Carolina was a whole territory by itself, but then it split up into two separate colonies of North and South. You have to tell me why that is. Next, who was the colony of Georgia intended to help? So we're just kind of moving our way south, starting with Maryland and Carolinas, now down to Georgia, and Georgia had a distinct purpose. So there was a reason behind starting Georgia that was different than starting other colonies, and you'll be able to tell that from the PowerPoint slides. So it was a reason, and it was intending to help someone. That was a reason for starting Georgia. And you have to tell me why or who it was intending to help starting this colony. Next, what was the economy of the southern colonies based on? So you have to tell me how did the people of the South make their money? How were they economically stable? What did they do to make money, and what was their economy based on? And then finally, last, these first four are straight from the PowerPoint, but now you have to give me another compare and contrast. So compare and contrast the major differences and similarities between the southern colonies, middle colonies, and New England colonies. So you have to look back at all three. We started with the New England colonies, then we moved down to the middle colonies, and now we're talking about the southern colonies today. So you have to give me some things that are similar about all three of them, and then things that were different about all three of them. Okay, so that you've done compare and contrast before, so things are the same, things are different. Things that are the same are comparing, things that are different are contrasting. So let's get right into it with the southern colonies. Maryland was a religious refuge. And a refuge means that place where people could feel safe. So this first question with Maryland. It was a religious refuge. So more specifically, Lord Baltimore wanted to establish a colony where he and other people could safely practice Roman Catholicism. So you've heard of the city of Baltimore before in Maryland, probably. Baltimore is a city in Maryland, and it was named after this Lord Baltimore from England. There was a territory named Baltimore in England, and he was the lord of this territory of Baltimore. So he came over and just named it the same thing, named it Baltimore, but he named the colony Maryland. And he did this because he wanted to safely practice Roman Catholicism. As you remember from the last paragraph, most people in the New World, most people in North America were Protestant, which is different than Catholicism. Protestants, things like Lutherans, Lutherans and Catholics, they're different. They're both Christians, but they're different, different religions within being Christian. So he wanted a place where they were outnumbered. Roman Catholics were outnumbered by Protestants, so he wanted a place where they could practice Catholicism freely. So he was granted a charter for Maryland. Like I said, by the king has to grant a charter because these are all New England, or these are all English colonies. So he was granted by the king. Yep, it's good. You guys can go to Maryland. You can go to North America and start this colony of Maryland to practice the religion that you want. And so, like I was saying, this was to protect Catholics and Protestants, and the Protestants who outnumber them. So it was mostly Protestants and not very many Catholics, but the Catholics wanted to be able to still practice Catholicism without there being major conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants. So what Lord Baltimore did was that he issued this Toleration Act of 1649, and this Toleration Act made it legal, made it okay. So it was okay to practice any religion under Christianity. So any Christian religion was tolerated, was okay in Maryland. So whether it was Catholic or Protestant, they both fall under Christian, so they were okay. Thing that doesn't fall under Christian, Jewish doesn't fall under Christian. That's a different religion altogether. That's a different part of religion. So they were not protected under the Toleration Act, but anything that was Christian was okay under the Toleration Act. So next, we're going to talk about the Carolinas. So that's your next question. Why did the Carolinas break up into two, North and South? So King Charles granted 8 English nobles pieces of land that became called the Carolinas. So both North and South Carolina were all one thing. They were all Carolina. And the king granted 8 of his friends, 8 English nobles, chunks of land throughout North and South Carolina. So that's how this territory was divvied up originally. And the way that it split up between North and South was that the northern part ended up being settled by mostly people from Virginia. So people up in Virginia here, remember where Jamestown is. Jamestown is here. So Virginia was starting to be populated. So people moved from Virginia down into the part that is now North Carolina. And they were more subsistence farmers. They had their own small little farms, family farms, and they set up farmland and made profit from products like pine forests. So there's more forests up in North Carolina, pine trees up in North Carolina, so they could cut the trees down and make money off of cutting trees and selling the timber. Whereas in South Carolina, different people settled. It was people from the West Indies, England, and other parts of Europe. And they settled in the southern part and founded this city of Charleston, or Charlestown. So right here you can see Charlestown. They named it after the king. It was King Charles II. They named it after the king, and it eventually ended up being changed to Charleston. So Charleston is the city in South Carolina now, the large city in South Carolina now, but it started out as Charlestown and then turned into Charleston. So these are people from like the West Indies and England and all over Europe. New people coming over settled in South Carolina, whereas North Carolina, people just kind of moved down from Virginia. And also with these people that are moving to South Carolina, these people from the West Indies, they created plantations where they grew indigo and rice. So indigo is a plant that produces a blue dye. So anything that was colored blue at the time you needed indigo for that. So that indigo and rice were 2 really important plantation crops, and that's another difference with South Carolina. It was more plantations rather than forests up here in North Carolina. So those are the differences between North and South Carolina and why they kind of split up. Alright, here we go. So now we'll talk about Georgia. It was a colony for the poor. So that question of who was trying to help out poor people in England. So the colony of Georgia was founded by James Oglethorpe. So James Oglethorpe was a man over in England who wanted to start a new colony in North America. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to help debtors, and debtors are people who had landed in prison. So people who had committed small crimes, like theft or things like that, small crimes in England, got put in jail, and the only way they could get out of jail is if they paid back what they owed. So if they stole, a loaf of bread, they would be put in jail, and the only way they would be let out of jail if they paid back the money that they, didn't have to pay back that loaf of bread. Well, the thing is, if you're in jail, you can't work to get money, so people just ended up staying in jail for a long time because they didn't have any money to pay back their debt. And James Oglethorpe thought this system was pretty dumb, so he decided to come up with a way for these people that were sitting in jail to come up and make money. So he wanted to help these debtors who were sitting in jail in England. The king, however, wanted a colony to be a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. So whereas this James Oglethorpe, he was thinking about the poor people and trying to help the poor people, get out of jail and make some money so they could get out of jail. The King George in England was more interested in having a buffer. So a buffer basically means he wanted a bunch of land between Spanish Florida and his own territory in South Carolina. So he didn't want, he would rather have a bunch of poor people, basically, that he didn't care about as much, in between Spanish Florida and the plantations up in South Carolina. So that's what a buffer is. He just wanted something that he didn't care as much about in between, so that Spanish Florida couldn't just come over and start taking plantations and then up in North Carolina, and then Spanish would be invading. He wanted to have a buffer, so he thought he'd stick a bunch of poor people in Georgia. But that was just the king. James Oglethorpe, he was trying to help. He was actually trying to do like I said up here and help the debtors, help the people get out of jail. So Georgia, kind of ironically, was named after King George, this king that didn't really care about poor people that much. He just wanted to have a buffer, but they named it after him anyway because he was the king. So moving on to life in the southern counties. So that's all about kind of how the southern colonies were founded. Now let's move on to what life was like in the southern colonies. So it was an agricultural economy. So that question of what's their economy based on, it was based on agriculture. So farmers in the southern colonies grew cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. We've talked about all three of these now. Tobacco we've been talking about for a while, like in Jamestown. It's really important. You can see where these leaves are. That's tobacco, and here's tobacco up here. Rice down here, like down in South Carolina and Georgia. Rice plantations here, and then also indigo, like I said, to make blue dye down here. So that's the three things that they mainly grew in the South: tobacco, rice, and indigo. So using the Potomac, James, and York rivers, tobacco farmers shipped their crop from their plantations directly to England. For this reason, southern colonies had few port cities, and a lot less port cities than New England and the middle counties. So rather than, you can kind of see in this picture here, plantations were usually built right on a river, so they could load up boats right from the river and then send them directly to England for huge profits. They didn't have to pay people to ship it for them because the plantation owned their own ships and shipped it straight to England themselves. So they were just trying to make more money from not having big ports, rather than having big ports and having to pay merchants to ship things back and forth. They just did it themselves. So planters used the swampy coastal lands of Savannah River for growing rice. So that's kind of a picture of rice up here. You need swamps, and it grows in the water. And like I talked about, indigo was important for Carolina farmers as well. So now let's talk about the triangle trade here. We've talked about it a little bit in a previous slide, or in a previous PowerPoint presentation, but let's talk a little bit more about it. This is now the African population was a huge part of this triangle trade. So plantations depended on workers brought by force from Africa, and these are slaves. So you've heard of slaves in the United States, eventually leading to the Civil War, and this is how it all started, was that first came the agriculture, and people realized that they could make a lot of money off of this agriculture, and then they decided that they could make even more money if they didn't have to pay people to work the agriculture and just have free work by way of slaves. So the Middle Passage was the route between Africa and America. So down here, Middle Passage, so this pink line here, which brought slaves in overcrowded ships. So slave catchers would actually take people from West Africa, take people by force from West Africa, Africans living there, and take them over to the Caribbean islands, and then they would be shipped up to these plantations like this one right here, in up to Charleston. And it was in overcrowded ships, terrible conditions. You've probably seen pictures of the slave ships of people coming over, and just terrible conditions. So under the slave codes, enslaved people were property. They weren't human beings anymore. They were property to be owned. So they could, plantation owners could make slaves work for nothing and get away with it because they thought of these slaves as property rather than human beings. So there were some rebellions and resistance by enslaved people. People tried to run away. People tried to rebel, but there was not much success, almost very little success, because they were just outnumbered in just terrible conditions. So there was some resistance, but not really much to speak of because it was just so violent and so cruel. They couldn't do much. These slaves couldn't do much against their white owners. Very few people became skilled workers. There were just a couple instances of slaves being able to be freed and become carpenters and seamstresses. But overall, it was just people were enslaved and working for nothing under just brutal conditions. A few slaveholders gave their servants freedom, like I said, but once again, that was not the majority. Very few people were granted their freedom, and it was like I said, few instances of positive, but not much positive from this Middle Passage and slaves being forced to work plantations in the South. So life on the southern colonies, on the plantations, the wealthy upper class consisted of rich planters who developed their own way of life on their plantations. So it was kind of their own little world on their plantations because they were so rich. A plantation often consisted of a family mansion called the big house. I'm thinking this would be a big house right here, like a big mansion. Other smaller buildings around would be like barns and laundries and stables. So there would be some distance away from the slave quarters. Like I said, they were just treated like slave quarters would maybe be down here. Be some distance away to keep the slaves away from white people, because like I said, there were just terrible conditions in relationship between the two. So with so many workers, with this free slave labor, and with all their means and all their money, plantations were usually self-sufficient. So that basically meant that they were like their own little town, their own little settlement, where they did everything. They made their own food, they made their own clothes, had their own shelters. Everything that you needed to live was right here, and so it was self-sufficient in that way, that they didn't need to go out to a big town, or they didn't have to go to the city to get things, because they could just make everything they wanted right there. So that's it for the southern colonies. Answer those questions to be able to answer, and yeah, make sure to remember to do the compare and contrast between all three. Think back, use the other PowerPoints to fill out those compare and contrast questions.